Hello and welcome to Learning Music with Pat. I've decided to start off today with this little tiny saxophone. Let's take a closer look to now this is small, but I have to tell you, this is a working saxophone. This actually plays, and I'm going to twist it around so you can see it. There is a reason why I brought it in. I do carry most of my instruments. In fact, all of my instruments I carry in every time I do a show, but I can only carry so much. This little thing is playable, it's electronic, but it has many of the features in its design that a regular saxophone has. So in bringing it in, I save myself carrying the weight of all the saxophones that I have, because my saxophones, most of them are older and they're very heavy. I don't have any real lightweight ones. And yet it can show you the various parts to instruments. I've had so many people talk to me about instruments and they have no clue as to what I'm talking about. I brought in a bass recorder and they thought I was playing a French horn. You know, there's all kinds of differences in instruments. And I remember when I was a child, we had, as a part of my first grade education, and it continued on up from there, we had lessons in classes in how to identify instruments to know what they are. So if you hear a sound, where's the sound coming from? Is it a French horn? Is it a saxophone? Is it a flute? We were able to identify the sounds of the various instruments and also what the instruments looked like. So when I brought out a saxophone to play, no one's calling it a French horn, they're calling it what it is. So this is a little tiny saxophone, and what I want to do with it is show you the different parts to the saxophone, as I'm going to do with some of the other woodwind instruments today, such as the flute and the clarinet, oboes and bassoons, and this gives us a good head start on it, because even though it's electronic and it's playable, its design is like that of a regular saxophone in many respects, so I can show you a lot of the design. Now let's take a look at the top of it. I want to hold it in such a way. Perfect. This is perfect. Take a look at that. This is a neck piece. When you get to the top of the saxophone, you have that piece that pulls over. You know, it kind of folds over to one side. That's called a neck piece. Now, this neck piece would approximate a tenor saxophone because it has a little crook in it. The alto saxophones and some of the other saxophones, when it makes that little turn, it just keeps straight until you get to the mouthpiece. There's no little crook in it. So if you have a little crook in it, that's an indication that it is a tenor saxophone. Now, this here is an octave mechanism, and it looks almost exactly like the octave mechanism in most saxophones. In this regard, if I point my finger down here, there's a little kind of a metal piece that wraps around the neck piece, and most saxophones have that, and it's connected to this little piece up here that's curved. It curves over the neck piece, and then it ends with this little right here. And when you press a key on the back of the saxophone, which is about where my finger is, then this pops up. Now, it won't do it on this one because this is an electronic instrument and it won't do it. But it does move a little bit. I just don't want to take the responsibility of breaking it. When that little metal piece pops up, then you have an octave. You press the key, you blow into the instrument, and whatever you're playing goes an octave higher. I want to mention the mouthpiece to you. This is like a perfectly shaped mouthpiece for a saxophone. It doesn't have a reed because it's electronic, but it has a mouthpiece which is shaped very, very similar, and you have a little place where you blow into it, which would be right here. And then there is, and I'm going to switch this around because to see it, there, that's perfect. Now, This little piece here is called the ligature. It holds the mouthpiece in place because when you take a saxophone apart, you take the mouthpiece off, you take the neck piece off, you take those two pieces off, and when you put it back on, that mouthpiece has got to be attached to the neck piece in such a way that it doesn't fall off. And the way they do it is they have a ligature. This area here is called the ligature, and there is a little screw, and that's true of most saxophones. In fact, most saxophones have two screws there, but there are ligatures I've seen that are just one screw. I like the two screws much better. It gives you a lot more flexibility in terms of how you tighten the mouthpiece to the neck piece. There is something that you have to do that, and you have a lot more flexibility in doing that if you have two screws. But there are some that have just one screw. So you have the mouthpiece, the reed would be under here, and here's the ligature holding the mouthpiece to the neck piece, which is right here, and then this is the octave mechanism. There are a few saxophones, and I have one of them, that have the octave mechanism underneath, but most of them do not. Most of them have it on top just the way that this is shown. Now, when you get down here, and I'm just going to raise this up, let's go to the bottom part of the instrument. This whole thing from here to here is the bell. And now this here is the body of the instrument. You go from the neck piece and all the paraphernalia that's connected with the mouthpiece, you go down straight. That's the body of the instrument. The keys that you play are going to be on the front. Now, this isn't an exact representation, but it is somewhat of a representation where your main keys are in the front. But you have a lot of side keys, and you can see them on the side. Those are fairly accurate, not exactly, but fairly accurate, and that's where you get some of your notes, and that's where you get some of your sharps and your flats. And when you get to the bottom of the instrument, where this curve is, and it swings up, and that's where the bell is. This whole area where I've got my fingers, that whole area from bottom here to this part here is a bell because it flares out on top. All of the saxophones have them. Even there are straight saxophones. In fact, I have a straight soprano saxophone. It still has a little flare on the bottom of it. So here's your mouthpiece, your ligature, your neck piece, your octave mechanism, which could be called just an octave key. There's a difference between an octave mechanism and an octave key. An octave key is what this actually has. You press the key, this pops up, and you get an octave. Now, on the clarinet, when you press a key, you don't get an octave. You get an octave plus 5 other notes. So it's not a true octave key, so it's called a mechanism. It's a mechanism for the upper notes, and the notes are not a true octave. So what you have to do with the clarinet is you have to learn 2 sets of fingerings for the clarinet, one for the upper register and one for the lower register. On the saxophones and on the flutes, all you have to do is pop that little key and you go up an octave, so your upper register, the fingering for the notes is almost exactly the same as the fingering for the lower notes, except that you have to have the octave key. Now, that may not be true for all of the notes, but it's true for most of them. Now, one thing that I also want to mention, if you're playing a keyboard, it's called a keyboard. You press one finger, one note. These instruments, when you get to the woodwinds, are called a fingerboard. It's not the same as a keyboard. The keyboard, all of the keys look exactly alike. Some are higher, some are lower. You have some flats and some sharps. But all of these can be different. So this is called a fingerboard, not a keyboard. And you're going to notice on this bell, I'm glad they showed it, there are keys on the bell. It's not just it swoops up and you have that flaring. There are keys on the bell. And on a real saxophone, that's the case. You have some real low no keys. And the interesting thing for most of these woodwind instruments that are more complicated, they have rods in them. You don't actually see the rods for the most part because the rods are inside little pieces of straight metal, circular straight metal. So you can press a key in one place and you can press a note on one place and have a key open up in a completely different place, and it's done through the rods, and they have springs. They're very, very complicated. One of the reasons that I love the woodwinds, the simple woodwinds, is that it's much easier. You don't have to worry about rods and pads and corks and screws and everything like that you have to worry about on a regular instrument. But these instruments are very, very complicated. It's not unusual to have on the bell different kinds of keys, and there is a low key, and it's right down here. It's in that little spot that also exists on a saxophone. The other thing that's not unusual, and I'm glad it shows it, is these on the bell usually have a frame. There are two keys underneath here, and they usually have a frame on top of them, and that protects them. You know, when you lay an instrument down in its case, the case has to be perfectly fitted so you don't damage the keys. There are little indentations in the soft padding of the instrument where the instrument lays, and it's all specially designed so that every key can lay in a certain place and the instrument is not disturbed. And I urge you, if you have an instrument and you don't have a case for it, please, please, please get a case for it. You can get soft cases, you can have hard cases. I like hard cases better because I think they're more protective, but soft cases, they work as well. They work pretty well too. The instrument needs to be protected. If you bend a rod, a simple little thing, or even if you get a spring out of place, it's not going to play right. That's how delicate they are. They're not going to play right. Now, I was doing a solo on a brand new instrument. I still have it. It's a beautiful instrument. It's a straight soprano saxophone. And they make curved ones and straight ones, although I don't think they make the curved one anymore. Very, very small, not much bigger than this, a fully functioning saxophone. And there was a little tiny spring, and it was out of place. I couldn't figure out why it didn't want to play certain notes. And it was a brand new instrument. And I worked with it, and suddenly I saw it. It was a little spring, and it had dislodged from a little place where it was attached. So I took a fingernail, and I worked with it, and I got it back to where it was supposed to be, and the instrument was fine. I did my solo without any trouble. And I didn't know if I was going to find it. I knew there was something wrong with it. It doesn't have to be a lot to get it off base. It really doesn't have to be a lot. And so let's see, what else do I want to show you about this? The side keys also give you regular notes, plus it gives you sharps and flats. You don't need to, you don't want to forget that. But the major parts, mouthpiece, neck piece, octave mechanism, body, and bell. You see how much you can teach. And it has good proportion. And as I said before, this is playable. This is a playable, workable saxophone. I've had it in maybe once or twice before to show you something, but I've never played it in here. But my purpose in bringing it here today, is just to show you the different parts of the saxophone. Now, I'm going to show you some charts. I'll probably get home and say, oh, why didn't I think of this, or why didn't I think of that? But at any rate, it's loaded with different kinds of keys. Now I'm going to show you some charts with however much time we have left, and we'll get that set up, because I want to show you the parts of the instruments. This is good, Rick. All right, here's a recorder. It's a simple instrument, but it has definite parts to it. Here is your mouthpiece right here, and that's called a Fipple mouthpiece, because inside that mouthpiece is another little piece, and you blow in, and the air comes out of this. This is the labium. The labium is that little piece, and I'll show you on one of my recorders in a few minutes. And this little place goes slanting in. That's the lip. to the labium, and this whole labium can be called a window. So, mouthpiece, labium, also called a window with this lip in it. Now, this is also a bore. It's like a straight tube in there. It's not designed that looks like a straight tube, but it is a straight tube, and it's a bore. And if you consider the whole thing, it can be called a windway. Okay, and this is going to be the head joint. This is the most important for me to show you so you recognize it when you see it. Other things, you'd have to pull it apart to see it, but here is the head joint. It goes from this part right here to the top. Then this is the body right here. And when you get down here, that's the foot joint. And you see the little flare? That little flare would be the bell. It's not much of a bell, it's not much of a flare, but it is there. And if you look at it, these are all tone holes. This would be the fingerboard. This is all tone holes. And in the back of the instrument, you have a thumb hole, which is another tone hole, which you need to use for octaves and for some notes. So let me demonstrate a little bit. It's easier to see it, I think, on this instrument, which is why I like to bring in the lighter colored instruments rather than the dark ones. From here to here, head joint, labium right here, and although you may not be able to see it, even if I twist it, that little place in that labium it kind of slants inward, so that if I put my finger there, I would hit the top part. That is your lip. And this also can be called a window. Then when you get down here, you get to the body of the instrument. And this is the fingerboard. The whole thing can be called a windway. It is basically a straight tube. And then you have the bottom. This is going to be the foot joint. This comes apart. Not all recorders come apart like this, but good recorders usually come apart in 3 parts. You can pull a head joint off, you can keep the body like this, and you can pull the joint off, the foot joint off. However, not all recorders can be pulled apart. Usually you can take the head joint off, but some of them you can't pull the foot joint. It's like 1 unit instead of 3 units, but the best of them have it as 3 units. And why would they do that? Well, for cleaning purposes. For the most part, you don't put cork grease in it. There's no cork grease in it. There's no corks in it. It's a very simple instrument, but it does have its own individuality, and it does have its own way of working, because sometimes you have cork in an instrument. The older instruments had cork in them. That means you have to put on cork grease. If you don't have cork grease, then Vaseline will do. So that's basically the recorder. Now, if you take the instrument, if you take the instrument and you put it to one side, and I've done that in a fingering chart, which I'll probably show you next time. I won't have time to do it today. I try to draw the instrument, so that you can see it on like a slant where you can see the tone hole in the back. The problem with teaching people about this instrument is the fact that you can't really see the back tone hole. I can be doing all kinds of octaves, and except for the D, which I did an alternate fingering for, that tone hole is covered, and if I want an octave, I slip my thumb down a little bit, and so I leave it partially uncovered, but not completely uncovered. That's called half-holing. But with that half-holing, I get octaves. You wouldn't know I was doing it because I'm not making much of a motion in my back with my thumb, but you can't see it, you know, when I'm holding it. So when I try to draw the instruments, I try to draw it as if it was a little bit on the side. This is the tone hole in the back, the thumb hole, and it's pretty much opposite that first hole. This here is going to be your head joint, your foot joint, and sometimes at the bottom of some instruments, but not all, you have a double hole. This instrument has a double hole right here. It has a double hole. And right here, it has a double hole. There are two small holes. Why do I have it? Now, not all recorders have it. Some of the older ones don't. But it helps in you getting sharps and flats because you don't have to do so much half-holing. It's easier just to get your flats and your sharps that way. And that's the reason that it's there. So the better instruments do have that. So when I show you the fingering chart, which I'm going to show you later on, probably next time, I will draw the instrument in such a way that you can see the holes from the side. That's the double hole there. And that you can see the tone hole in the back, which is also called the thumb hole. And because some of the times, for some notes, that has got to be kept open. Sometimes it has to be closed. And sometimes you've got the half hole, so it's half closed and half open. Now, if I were to take the recorder and pull it apart for you, I do have one that I can do that with, but I didn't bring it in. Here's your block, here's your mouthpiece, and this is a block. It's in the back of the mouthpiece. It becomes part of the mouthpiece. It's right here. You don't see the whole thing. You only see this part, which is usually colored a little different color than the regular instrument is. So you know that's there, and it sticks down, right down to where the labium, and which is right here. Then, of course, this is your bore. This labium is the window, and this thing is the lip to the window. And this is where you blow in. It's also called the windway. It's called a Fipple mouthpiece. And I may bring in one where you can actually see it. And I just have it drawn in different ways here. Here's your block. Here's your mouthpiece where you blow right in. This is the block, the labium, and the bore. That's what the inside of a recorder really looks like. Now, there are so many different recorders, and I have basically all of them except for the straight basses. And this is kind of just to show you a size. This is a Sopranino. They're small. They're like 9 inches long. This is the soprano, which is what I usually bring in and which most people play, and it's about a foot, 12 and a half inches long. This is an alto. It's quite a bit bigger. The finger stretches are greater. This is a tenor. I do have a couple of them. They do have a couple of keys. They have a very, very rich tone, and they're called a tenor. This is a folded bass. The original drawing didn't have a folded bass, so what I did was I drew one, trying to keep it more or less in the style of the other drawings. Has 2 or 3 keys. It's gorgeous. It's a beautiful instrument. It's over 30 inches long. And these straight basses and great basses are so tall. They're like 57 inches. And a lot of times you play them standing up. And they may actually be almost taller than the person playing them, so they don't blow into the top of the instruments like you do in these. You blow into this place, this little metal piece, which is called a bocal. That takes the air and moves it up and down. So a lot of those instruments are played standing up. I think next time I come, I may try to bring, just so you can see what these instruments are. I just have another sketch here, and you can see how much bigger this straight bass is than this one here, which is the folded bass, which I do have. Sopranino, soprano. No, this is a sopranino, soprano, alto, tenor, folded bass, and straight bass. Now, I can see I'm beginning to run out of time, so I'm not going to be able to get very far here. So what I'm going to do is close it, and then I'll continue. Well, let me show you just 2 more pictures quickly. This is my drawing of a folded bass. It's a recorder, but it's a folded bass, and it's this is without the keys. And if I can do it, this is the folded bass with the keys. Most recorders don't have much keys. You have to depend upon finger stretches. But in some of them, if they're larger, they have to have some keys because you couldn't stretch your fingers as much as you need to. So the labium is here, mouthpiece here, and your keys right here, 3 or 4, not a lot of them. That's the folded bass. Very, very beautiful tone. And the great bass, which I also drew a picture of here, this is it. I don't have one of these. They're so tall. There's a little metal piece that you put down on the bottom, so when you stand it up on the floor, the instrument itself doesn't go on the floor, but this metal piece does, and that protects the bell of this other instrument. But they're very, very tall, and you blow in here, which is the vocal, as I said before. The labium is up here. They do have some keys down here, but they do have some other keys also. Otherwise, you couldn't stretch your hands out far enough to be able to play it. They are beautiful, beautiful instruments. Those instruments cost thousands of dollars. So if you ever hear somebody say, oh, the recorder, it's just a toy, you know, you can just tell them that's not the case. A recorder is a legitimate, very well-loved instruments. There are orchestras all over the world that only play recorder, and they play classical music. I arrange classical music for recorders, and they do very well with it. They can do an awful lot. So it's not a toy and should not be treated as a toy. I may put that on my tombstone. I have it put on my tombstone after I die. The thing I want to be known as a recorder is not a toy. It's a regular instrument. Well, I'm going to close it here. We're out of time, and I'm just going to continue with this next time. So please join me then.